Okay, welcome to part two of Bitcoin Hard Talk, episode 74, where we're going to be covering everything that is happening this week in macro. So the Federal Reserve and the US Proof of Weapons Network released its numbers for CPI, which is a proxy of inflation. And you can look at different proxies. You can go to Trueflation. The problem with this proxy is that it's priced in the world reserve currency. And as you are pushing out more and more dollars through the proof of weapons network to get everyone addicted to debt, you get this obfuscation of inflation because the goods are priced in the same currency that is being strengthened. And so you have this very hard mechanism for delivering the real inflation. The middle class feel wrecked and they're being told, but inflation isn't that problematic, because they used economics in order to say you must have 2% inflation. Now, the 2% inflation goal is no longer realistic. So the Fed is saying we won't do anything until we get towards that 2% goal. But it looks like 3% is the new 2%. And so therefore, you have this battle between the Federal Reserve and Treasury, which is looking at doing potential monetary reform, potential Bitcoin strategic reserves, but also trying to pressure the Federal Reserve to lower rates because they have their own fiscal crisis, and the bank benefits from that. And the Fed is a organization where it works for its shareholders, which is the banks that benefit from all the debt and destruction. So you have this consumer price index, and that was a little bit of a stimulus to make sure that the market that was correcting had a little bit of life. And so inflation dropped to 2.8%, which is beating expectations of 2.9%. Now, it's not what the figure says, it's whether it beats expectations, because the market expects something. And so when it is better or lower inflation than the expected 2.9%, that is considered bullish for the market. And so, of course, Trump will say, you know, we're controlling Biden inflation, and push that narrative as well. But what he wants to do is get the rates down so he can refinance the debt-based Ponzi scheme, and then try and get it where the Fed lowers those rates and prints more money in an economic stimulus through QE, reversing the QT, quantitative tightening scheme. And basically what we're seeing today, is a potential government shutdown, because Trump is pretending that we're going through a painful time in order to change the economy, where he's asking for $1.6 trillion of debt, saying that Doge is saving about $105 billion if you look at the debt clock. So pretending that we're saving money when actually he's asking for more money. And so people like Thomas Massie are saying, no. And then Democrats like Chuck Schumer are being weaponized in order to, you know, try and get some of the things that they want, with this belief that the government could shut down. Now, that's being voted right now. And it did happen last time during the Trump administration. I think it was about 30 to 40 days, if memory serves me right, where the government couldn't pay any bills. It was shut down, and then they enter into this negotiation to get the rate up, but it's simply about crony capitalism happening, saying, put my stuff in there, get my money of the additional money that's printed over to my people that are paying me, give me my kickback, and then I will vote and agree. So Congress are just prostitutes for the fact that you just buy their vote, and then you can control power and you call it democracy. And so this figure, you know, while it's coming down, it doesn't really reflect any of the changes that have happened so far. So there has been the tariff wars. There has been volatility in the market. There's been price adjustments. We're moving to what will be reciprocal tariffs on the 2nd of April, which hopefully will create more of an understanding without these like different narratives that are causing lots of volatility, and also commitment from Trump to get the price of oil down. Now, we had that oil price correction. Last time I looked, I think we're at about $65, or I think it went down to a low of $62 from a peak of about 82. And it went beyond, it went during the last time the Fed did a pump and dump scheme to take down Silicon Valley Bank and various other things. We had this hike in oil price that led to the inflation that led to the collapse of the banks. And then the excuse for creating a new tool, more money printing, more lending. Expect a similar type of thing, but this time we're seeing the reversal of trying to get those oil prices down and those oil corrections. And so that is leading to a change in narrative. The narrative is now coming around. Are we in recession? Are we going to go into recession? Officially in 2022, it was in recession because it was defined as 2 quarters of negative or lower growth. And that happened, and then they kind of redefine it to make you think a little bit differently. But now there are talks around recession. Now, we know the game. If you get a recession, then you have less debt, which is less money. Less money equals less debt. And then you go into deflationary environment, which is a depression or recession, which the controllers of finance will never allow to happen. So you either get a pivot from the government on the fiscal side, where they say we could print a new stable coin, for example, and stimulate the economy, because they've got to get the votes. And the people that are paying will then kick in and say, if you don't get that stop price and if you don't wipe out middle-class America further, then we're going to vote the other side. And so the pivot has to happen. Or the Federal Reserve does the pivot and it moves to lower rates, QT, a debt-based Ponzi scheme, and further destruction, which is the Biden model as well. So it's the same model every time. It's just done under a different narrative, because they will never allow deflation to happen, because then the banks contract the amount of credit that they're creating. That makes money disappear. And then you enter into a depressionary or recessionary environment. And the controllers that own the government will not allow that to happen. And the banks that own the Federal Reserve, they'll say, let's just ride this donkey. Let's ride the US dollar proof of weapons network to full violence. And then we'll do a controlled transition like we did from the Bank of England to the Federal Reserve to whatever the artificial intelligence technocracy and whatever they've designed the system to be next. So they won't allow GDP to go down. And what were they pushing GDP for? They said America is the largest economy in the world. But what was it? It was literally printing money, sending it to all sorts of corruptions from non-governmental organizations, using the IMF and NATO and the intelligence agencies to force countries to borrow these dollars and then spend it back in America so that it goes in the direction of the corrupt. And then they call it increase in GDP as all this unproductive spending is happening. I don't know how to estimate this, but my guess is that half of the stock market was just pumped up by the government, which is the very definition of socialism and crony capitalism, which is what the Federal Reserve was designed to do. And those that own the assets say, please pump the market further because I don't want my assets to go down. Because the reality is that America's GDP and everybody else, which are the derivatives on top of it, 9% inflation in America equals 900% inflation in Zimbabwe, says if you allow GDP to lower, then we get this recollaboration where we actually start stopping lending our money by buying bonds to the US government. And then we convert it back to our currency and we invest in our own economies. And then we have more money to work with BRICS and the Belt and Road Initiative. And America gets to build its regional by weakening the dollar and strengthening other currencies so it can rebuild its manufacturing base. And we enter into that. We are in that environment. Now, will America believe in capitalism? Well, no, it's the Federal Reserve in the market, which leads to asset stripping, which leads to corporate raiding, and then a reinvigoration of the proof of weapons network with all those that benefit from it cheering along saying capitalism is back. The government gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And that's why it's being told to you through Doge, we're saving all this money, but at the same time, we're threatening a government shutdown if you don't give us a lot more money as well. So it's completely fake. It's completely fake narrative. And, it is essentially reducing. We're seeing whether if you want, free markets again, you have to reduce the fiscal deficit. And that is the vast majority of dollars. And so you'd have to have a monetary reform at the same time, which is why I've always been saying, America, build your Bitcoin strategic reserves, release the corruption like USAID, National Endowment of Democracy, and then you can have the tools through stable coins, but you transition from one system to the other. But are you going to be doing these large stimulus based upon a debt-based Ponzi scheme? And that's the change that needs to happen. I have zero faith in governments doing it because I believe the systemic structural problem of the corruption of the fake democracies is what is making a recession never able to happen at the expense of middle class until eventually the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. And then that leads to, the types of revolutionary movements that America has been inflicting upon African nations and Middle Eastern nations. And as Europe and America start fighting each other, you end up with, these types of things. But you need to protect yourself with Bitcoin, and that's the whole macro play we need to understand. So as I said, they're calling it austerity from the left democratic narrative. The MAGA narrative is saying we're winning. We are stamping out all the corruption. The Proof of Weapons Network is saying we'll give them freedom of speech, but not freedom of reach. If you speak against Mossad or anything, we'll stop all of the Jeffrey Epstein files, the 9/11 files, the JFK files from blaming it on where it actually came from. And instead, we'll say it's the CIA and we can blame it on the Democrats. And really, you're just recollaborating the exact same system, but creating that two-tiered narrative that makes people think they have an element of control of it as well. And as I said, it's good that they add the Doge savings to the US debt clock. If you type in Google US debt clock, you can see that the ticker symbol of the debt that the Proof of Weapons Network benefits from. And now they've created the amount of money that's being saved. Last time I looked, and it keeps changing, it was 175 billion, and then it moved to 105 billion. But you can keep monitoring that on the debt clock website. So we shall see what happens today. Does the government get a shutdown? The government is being weaponized to say, while we're saving 100 billion, we would like 1.65 billion of additional budget, discretionary budget for the Trump administration. And that is 47% more than what Obama's last budget was. And so, it's the same system, but different narrative. Okay, so anyone that fights against that is being, really weaponized, as it were. Thomas Massey, who exposes all of these things, like every Congress member has an AIPAC handler from the Israeli lobby. And he said, no, I will not allow for additional. We're trying to contract. He's doing the right thing. And suddenly Trump comes out and says, Thomas Massey, he does a campaign against him to try and get the MAGA crew to go nuts and turn against itself, even from within, at the same time as pushing it's the Democrats that are causing all the problem as well. And of course, the Israeli lobby likes it when you take the only person exposing the system, because then you can have a controlled demolition or the elimination of anyone that speaks against Israel, which clearly is showing that by being the only foreign agent that is able to bribe it and has all these NGO networks and has full congressional control, they get to perpetuate the Proof of Weapons Network, which is kind of what we'll be covering in the geopolitical side. America in its controlled demolition could win the AI race, but Israel, in its occupation of all the Congress members, wants it to go to war with Iran so that it can use the old model and it can continue to sit between China and America, steal America's technology and sell it to China and sit itself in the middle and push America into war by pushing the narrative of the forever wars, which is the old model. And that is the friction that you need to understand. And that's what we'll go through in the geopolitical side as well. Anyway, the 1.6 million, what is it being asked for? Well, it's looking for temporary increase in budget so that it can then use that money and then try and weaponize the Fed to reduce rates so it can restructure the debt-based Ponzi scheme and borrow more and create more dollars at the expense of middle-class America and middle-class world, because that inflation is exported. Okay. So that's the shutdown story. I'll cover it next week because it's happening in real time right now. But we'll see what happens there. Just so you know, it proposes a $6 billion increase in defense spending. Defense, which is saying we don't need those forever wars anymore. We're going to get NATO to pay for it. We're going to ask Europe to print money, spend it back into America to weaken the dollar to rebuild its manufacturing base and strengthen the euro and do a debt stimulus based upon Putin's stolen money. But at the same time, we want NATO to spend more and we want to sell more weapons and hand over the war machine to Europe as we rebuild the fact that we gave all of our defense to Ukraine, Israel, and the 100 proxy wars that they've been fighting. This is a real signal that the corruption is actually making America's real defense not work. And so it's been spent money. So budget is going into defending the borders, which is one thing the Trump administration has delivered. Absolutely credit where it's credit's due. In order to stop the fact that all these wars creates refugee crisis, and then everyone needs to get into the economy where their country is lending it to the US government because it's attracting all the capital flows. But if you move to this new transition, maybe countries can be rebuilt by using their own capital markets and lending to their own governments and actually investing in their own people. And then maybe people will want to go to their own countries, and they only left in the first place because the proof of weapons network created covert regime changes, death, destruction, overthrow of democracies, and replacing it with dictators, as we've always covered anyway. But they want an increase on defense spending. So we know what that means. You know, this is the corruption of those that control the Trump administration that want that money to go back to Israel so that the old model and America can be sacrificed in order to make sure that you and Americans get in another forever war with Iran while the European Union continue the forever war against Russia to sacrifice all the people in between, while, you know, those controllers decide who's going to get the gas, who's going to get the oil, and the AI race continues as well. It also includes, as I said, additional funding for border enforcement, another $1 billion of budget as well. So that's a good thing. And the only person on the Republican side that is also exposing the system, Thomas Massie, he voted no, so he got an attack from the Trump administration. And it is just being exposed that while we're being told that America has freedom of speech, they're going against the First Amendment, the Second Amendment. They're arresting people for, protesting against the wars and what's happening in Gaza at the moment. The files are not being released because they implicate Mossad. Anyone that speaks up against this is being weaponized even on the right side. And anyone, the old war machine, corrupt war machine, the neocons on the left, they're being made as if they're the war people, and the right people are not the war people. As I said, it's all the same thing. and that distracts people because it's not acting in America's best interest as well. Okay. What else have I got for you on the macro side? As I said, the goal here, as I see it at the moment, is to push down interest rates. That's the main goal. And if it requires, a temporary economic craziness through tariff wars, and a government shutdown in order to achieve it, that's one way to get it. And then a return to the old model as well, with everyone cheering it along, saying we're winning. As I said, I've always covered the key is you've got to be, if the rich are going to get richer and the poor are going to get poorer under this model, then you need to be accumulating the assets. You need to be boycotting debt because that's the grease of the engine. You need to be saving in assets which are designed over the long term, not financial advice, to beat the system, which was Bitcoin. And then you essentially, by owning more Bitcoin this month than the previous month, you get to long-term escape the system. And by owning it in self-custody, you get to boycott the system. And then you can have more control over your monetary flows and have a resistance movement against it, while everything maybe get involved in politics to get out the corruption, and do the reforms that are needed. So Congress are doing what they are paid to do. When you follow the money, they're doing exactly what they're meant to do. Trump and the administration is not saving the average American. It is just a different corporate raiding and asset stripping strategy, handing over the EU war machine, while the US and China transition to technocracy. And the billionaires that are creating the technology, they were all sat around Trump, because they're the ones that are receiving all the money as a result of this asset stripping, and they're getting to benefit from it. While the rest of the world figures out how to build the resources, and those resources can be recollaborated into decentralized, open source, artificial intelligence as a resistance, social networks as a resistance, and Bitcoin as a resistance as well. And that's kind of where I think the map of the world is going right now. And that's where, so this week was about shrinking the stock market in order to try and get rates down. The Zelensky theater, which I covered last week, was all about increasing NATO budget from Europe, while making sure that chunks of that the war machine in Europe keeps Europe strong enough, but under the control of the expensive natural gas, so that Trump and America can control Europe through controlling those exports. Something went wrong, which is that they tried to weaken Russia, but then it aligned itself with BRICS. And so tariff wars are recollaborating, where America's, kind of looking at who's our enemies. And are we working with Mexico? Are we working with Canada? Are we working with Europe? Are we working with Panama? Are we working with Greenland? And then we move to reciprocal tariffs on April the 2nd, which is part of this painful part that people need to get to. While essentially the deep state, is it going to be exported or is it not? Is it going to be exposed or is it not? As I said, that's why the Epstein files need to show the truth. The Mossad element, not just the CIA element, and the JFK files and the 9/11 files, and all those different files, because then you can have an internal resistance based upon truth, and you've got the Bitcoin strategic reserves and stable coins and tools to actually transition to a better world as well. So this transition requires fighting with allies, whether it's Europe, Mexico, Canada, South America, Central America, and it requires a battle with the petrodollar and the eurodollar. And the profits of the deep state want to maintain the eurodollar, maintain the petrodollar, and that's what the Ukraine-Russia war is really about. And that's what Israel and Palestine is really about, because Israel is no longer working in what it was designed to originally do, unless, of course, it is designed to make sure America is rinsed and asset stripped, like Britain was by the Bank of England pre-World War One. Okay, so Canada on that side entered into the US-Canada trade war. That was the theatrics of this week. That was an escalation between Canada and America. That required a regime change. And so we went from the woke left narrative of Trudeau over to occupation of Canada by central banking, Bank of England, Bank of Canada, deep state agent, Mark Carney. And Mark Carney is the tough guy that's going to come along and make the change that is needed in order to stand up against Trump and execute this transition of the central banking proof of weapons network. So now they're not even hiding it. There is full occupation by central bankers in Canadian fiscal policy, not just monetary policy. So this means in case Canada doesn't give the central bank digital currency to the Central Bank of Canada, we can have a central banker that issues a technocratic stable coin, and we can make sure that the banks get that. And either way, we're funding both sides of the war throughout this transition, and they can hedge their bets. So they installed and implanted a regime change. Trudeau is over. Mark Carney is now the new head of Canada. And he's saying all the right things. What is he saying? Canada will never be the 51st state of America. And Trump's coming out and saying that counters that it's going to be, you are going to be the 51st state of America, rallying up the troops, creating these internal distractions, and making people think that this is all done in the name of patriotism. And the tariffs will disappear, he said. Trump said the tariffs will disappear if Canada joins the US as the 51st state of America. And so the US hikes tariffs on the Canadian steel and aluminium to 50%. And then Canada says, we're going to retaliate. And now you got Mark Carney fighting Trump, executing the globalist agenda in these regime changes of fake democracies. And Trump demands that Canada drop it's, what is it said, 250% to 390% tariffs that Canada has on US duty, calling these outrageous in order to rile up the MAGA, in order to say, you've been treating us so badly. We're going to be treated better. Go Trump, get the tariffs out there, while they execute the vision. And the cults are getting stronger and stronger in this extreme popularism. The Democrats are getting further and further away, saying, look, he's crashing the economy. You see? And all of this different theatrics is happening. And Canada then comes out and said, we are going to sell all of our US dollar bonds. And immediately we're going to, we're no longer going to buy those bonds. And then you get the exact thing that was wanted in the first place, a strengthening of the Canadian dollar, potentially if they sell them relative to the US dollar, or a pivot from the strategy, because this was just about renegotiating assets, creating, stripping those assets, fooling people into selling all of their assets, while the proof of weapons recollaborates on the other side of what it's actually going to look like. Remember, all of these wars are central banking wars. This is the hostile takeover and the regime change that is needed through these open border policies. So why do these open borders exist? So that you can immediately rile up the emotion of the people. You can change at a whim. And it's just a mechanism of deciding, do we want to be in civil war or not? Well, is there more assets to strip, or do we want to calm that down while all the rich end up in stable jurisdictions like Dubai and Singapore, or islands like I moved to get away from the GBP proof of weapons network. Anyway, so Mark Carney is actually going to be a better fight. So we haven't got the woke left tools of Trudeau. We've now got the financial weapons of mass destruction that Mark Carney is used to firing when he was installed into the Bank of England and the Bank of Canada. So in the end of the war, Trump came back and said, after they're saying that they're going to sell bonds, Trump threatened to double tariffs on imports of all steel and aluminium from Canada, but immediately decided to scrap his decision after Canada then came back and agreed to roll back a 25% surcharge that was levied as another financial weapon on electricity exports to US. And so the energy wars, the arms race, the recollaboration, the recognition that artificial intelligence is going to power is no longer troops. And all of this has been exerted for on April the 2nd. We have our reciprocal tariffs. We enter into less volatility, and the model is known. Who's going to be at war with who? Who's going to be providing all energy? And of course, the European Commission announced that they're going to impose counter tariffs of, I think it said, $26 billion euros, which is about $28 billion worth of US goods starting from next month. And so they're going to be imposing their tariffs. Then it moves to reciprocal, and you have to change the narratives to keep the war machine going, but change the euro dollar now that we have just this complete centralization and control of the major markets, and no concept of free markets, of free trade, of capitalism, just complete crony capitalism. And every day China's looking more and more like America, and America's looking more and more like China. And then they just meet in the middle with a stablecoin technocratic version or a central bank digital currency authoritarian version of the same model. So that was European Commission. They came out in their tariff war. And they said that this was in retaliation to Trump levying a 25% tariff on steel and aluminium, or aluminum, as you say in America, if you're watching from America. And this is what triggered the correction in the market. It led to a Bitcoin correction as well, and kind of hid the news that we covered, the very, very big news that we covered in This Week in Bitcoin. If you didn't watch that, go back to the This Week in Bitcoin. Hidden in that market correction was some really big news for those of you that have the longer term vision as well. So the S&P 500, it fell in one day. It's the lowest amount since September. I think it lost $1.7 trillion that was wiped out from the US stock market in one day. And over the 30 days of the Trump administration, wiped out $5.5 trillion in 30 days. Okay. And this is to exert the rotation that we are currently seeing into non-US dollar denominated capital markets, and to strengthen the non-US fiat currency proof of weapons networks, ready for probably the centralization pivot either from the Fed or the administration. Part of that strategy is to combat some of the inflation by getting the price of oil down. And we know that oil is controlled by Saudi Arabia. And so at the center of all these negotiations that we'll cover in the geopolitical section is Mohammed bin Salman and the UAE networks and the GCC and those with Russia, OPEC plus, and they're able to decide how many barrels of oil are we going to put out there to decide whether to crash a system or not, depending on the negotiations. So oil corrected down to $65 per barrel. Trump and the Trump administration has publicly stated that they want it down to $50 per barrel in order to combat inflation now that we've got the lower than expected CPI, when you can get the Federal Reserve to reduce the rates so that they can roll over all of the debt and print significantly more money when it goes to the other model. So OPEC Plus and Russia, they came out and they announced essentially that they are ready to cut production against Trump's wishes. And that is leverage for the negotiations, which ties into the geopolitical wars as well, and those negotiations. These are essentially negotiation tactics. This is when everyone meets in Saudi Arabia, which the meetings have already started. If they do get to this $50 per barrel, it will be a massive hit for the US oil producers, and OPEC Plus can sustain it, but I don't think they want it to go that low. And so those are the negotiations, and that's what will be determine the outcome of these things. But if we do move into a recession, that will create chaos on the natural gas market, and that will just wreak havoc everywhere as well. So these are the things that we need to see. Now, remember, Trump is a real estate guy, so he also benefits from the lower rates. And the real estate market, it is looking for lower rates in order to open up the credit markets, which is where the bank gets to create more dollars and use the Federal Reserve in order to basically print more money backed by real estate. And then Trump gets to do more deals, and those that from the bank lobby get whatever they wanted as well when they bought the administration. So I believe all of this recession talks, all of these tariff wars, this is the strategy to make the Fed way more likely to cut rates, and you expect a rate cutting environment, whereas before the Fed wasn't necessarily there. Some couple of other things as well worth following. The Financial Times reports that many European governments are feeling buyer's remorse for decades and decades of US arm purchases that have left them dependent upon Washington. And so that is about right. We need to, Europe, take up the reins. We have to keep the narrative that Trump is Hitler, and we need to start doing the Ukrainian flag thing and kill more Ukrainians. Is a sad tragedy of this whole thing because they don't have enough soldiers and the economics don't work. We've covered that in previous episodes as well. So the German defense giants was a... Sorry, I'll try and practice my German. Rheinmetall, basically came out and says that in order to facilitate this, we could take over the stock of the corporate raided Volkswagen, which was hugely, a part of everything that happened during World War II as well for the military-industrial complex. And so we can take away manufacturing cars, and we can take over those plants, and we can use them in order to produce tanks. And what happened last week? And in this, the price crashed so that you can asset strip it and use the productive economy for the European proof of weapons network. And you can get the ECB to print off more and more so that they can now have a wartime economic stimulus, and the market lapped it up and enjoyed it as we had this repatriation of capital out of America into the European Union war machine. That's what central banks do. That's why they were created in the first place. And no, they're not there in order to, support a stability in the markets. They are there for pump and dumps, to fund wars and get governments into debt, asset strip it, and move on to the next pump and dump Ponzi scheme over a multi-decade strategy, and wipe out the middle class, quite frankly. Right, what else have we got for you? In terms of summer flows as well, we need to watch what's happening in Syria, and this will lead to the geopolitical section as well. because for the very first time since the fall of the Assad regime within Syria, there was a Russian tanker with about 30,000 tons of fuel arrived in Syria, and that was following an agreement between Damascus and Moscow. And so the new regime is doing deals with Moscow while America occupies all the oil. And so the fact that these flows are allowing to happen might help us explain in the geopolitical section why violence uprised within Syria, and why our media, depending on where you were, based upon the funding of the military-industrial complex, intelligence, and lobby, was giving a different story to push a different narrative as well. And that was being perpetuated through all the paid influencers on X to push the narrative that was right for the regime change that they're actually looking for. So Iran used to supply Syria with approximately 3 million barrels a month. And now that is happening from Moscow, and those deals are being constructed. And so that kind of implies that the violence in Syria was an Israel first policy, and NATO through Turkey were aligned. And that explains all of the massacres and the narratives that you're about to be false flagged into to make you think something different is happening to what is actually happening. And so a supply that stopped after Damascus, what is the future of the Iran relationship? Well, that's why Israel is occupying more and more territory right now. And that's why you're getting a narrative of the tribes that were funded by Mossad, like ISIS, the funders that were the tribes that were funded by the CIA, like Al-Qaeda. You're starting to get that narrative in order to say, Muslims are killing Christians, was the narrative you were getting there. And so I'm going to dig deeper into that, but the monetary flows allow you to predate that because there's something going on between the relationship with Syria, Israel, Turkey, Russia, Iran, America, Qatar, UK, and that brings us into the geopolitical section. So that's going to do it for everything on This Week in Macro, or Bitcoin Hard Talk episode